Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Kai Björval. Thank you very much for taking the time and attending. And today, as you can see, we are going to have a look at Enscape with Rhino materials, how to set up convincing, beautiful materials and surfaces, where to get textures, what textures are about. I don't want to take away too much right now because we'll have a look at the topics in a second. But as always, I want to take a couple of minutes to let everyone settle in and join the meeting. Before that, a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, the webinar is being recorded, so you don't have to take notes if you don't want to. You will be sent a recording of the webinar in a follow-up email roughly 1 hour after it ended, with some additional information material, a link to our tutorials. So if you're interested in any other topics regarding Enscape and Rhino, you'll find everything in there. But also a recording of this very webinar. And yeah, apart from that, this webinar is likely to be posted on YouTube. So if you ask a question, you see the questions field somewhere, I think below the stream. Please be aware that I'm only going to read out your first name, so everything stays as anonymous as possible. Yeah, but it's possible that this webinar recording will be posted on YouTube, so please be aware of that. Yeah, apart from that, let's have another look at our website. Let me just open my browser here. This is the Enscape website, enscape3d.com. If you are new to Enscape, please be aware that you can always download a free trial on this page. So if you want to try it out yourself, you're good to go. If there is a topic that is not being covered in today's webinar that you were looking forward to, you can also always reach out to us by hitting the feedback button in the Enscape interface, or by writing an email to support@enscape3d.com. You can also respond to the follow-up emails that you receive and reach out to us that way. Or, of course, you can always go into the forums and have a look at what our community is currently doing, what they are sharing with the users to have a look at, and of course, ask any questions or get in contact with us or with the rest of the community that way. Exactly. Let's see. It seems like people are somewhat settling in. The webinar is scheduled for roughly 30 to 45 minutes, I suppose, and after that we will have a Q&A. So if you have any questions regarding Enscape, feel free to ask them in the questions field, either whenever it occurs, whenever the question occurs, or maybe when it fits, or after the main webinar has ended and the Q&A has begun. Yeah, so yeah, let's have a look at the topics in detail today. We will first have a look at the Rhino Material Editor and how to use it in connection with Enscape. We'll have a look at the Enscape Material Editor and how to use it, the differences between the two. We will have a look at the various material types that you can select in the Rhino Material Editor. We will check out where to find textures, free or paid for, and we will have a look at what kind of textures there are and how to use them effectively. So after this webinar is ended, you should have a firm grasp on how to set up beautiful, convincing materials and yeah, set up a convincing scene. And once again, if there's any questions regarding that, feel free to share it in the questions field and we'll have a look together into that. Let me just check if I forgot something or if everything seems to be set up properly. That is the case. Great. So let's begin with our first topic, the Rhino Material Editor overview. So let's switch to Rhino. First of all, this is the project that we're going to have a look at. This one is not available on our website, but please be aware that if you want to try out one project that has been set up ideally for Enscape, you can always go to our website, enscape3d.com. Again, scroll to the very bottom, and here's where you'll find the free sample projects page. Here you will find a sample project that has been set up with Enscape in mind for each of the design applications we support. And for Rhino, we have this sample project here. You can download it, have a look at it. I'm just using this one here because, just personal preference. In general, the great thing about Enscape, you might be aware of that, is that any project, any design that you might want to visualize will work right away with Enscape. And this being said, let's have a look at it in Enscape. I've already opened it, and this is the project. So you will get a similar result to this pretty much with any project you want to open with Enscape right away. However, the main portion of what you can achieve in terms of visual quality and beauty lies within materials, and that is what we're going to explore today. So let me align Enscape on the right half of my screen here. I'm commonly being asked how to do that easily and quickly. Of course, we recommend to use Enscape with 2 monitors. So you can continue using Rhino or whatever design application you're using, SketchUp, Revit, Archicad, Vectorworks. So you can continue using that in full screen. But if you're just using one screen like I have for this presentation, it's really useful to hold the Windows key and press the left or right arrow key. And that will prompt any window that is currently active to be aligned on the right or left half of the screen. And obviously, if you've ever played or if you've ever tried out Enscape yourself, you know that any changes you perform to your model will be updated in Enscape right away. So everything we're going to change regarding Enscape is going to happen in Rhino today. And if you want to work with the Rhino Material Editor, that's perfectly fine. You're good to do that. So let's load the Rhino Material Editor here, just selecting a surface and clicking this little cube icon. Let's have a look at the material we are having, or we see here right now. It's called Holzfarbe. That is German. Don't be surprised. That is translated to wood color. This is obviously no wood color anymore, but that doesn't matter. We are going to take this material apart anyways. Short summary regarding the Rhino Material Editor here. Whatever you do with the Rhino Material Editor, except for the, let's enhance it here, except for the environment texture that you can apply, everything apart from that is being recognized and displayed correctly. So we can, for example, start hiding or unchecking the textures we have here, and you'll see the material being taken apart. Once again, if you don't have too much experience with textures and what they are, we will cover this at a later step. But let's begin with the basics. So for your Rhino material, you have your color portion where you can select what color, what albedo value the material is displayed in. You can change it quickly here. The reflectivity that you see here, the reflection of the sun, for example, is being controlled by the glossiness. So we can set it to 100% and you will have something like a mirror, or we can set it to a lower value and the light reaching the surface that we're currently working on, the material, will be reflected in a more diffuse way. By the way, maybe a general look at what materials are. Now, Enscape is a real-time renderer, as you probably know. So everything you see is being generated in that very second, actually up to 60 times a second. And every pixel we see here is a kind of equation that the graphics card is going through. And every material or a material describes how each object behaves, whether it's green or red or white, whether it's reflective or non-reflective, and all of that is an equation that your graphics card runs through per pixel. And for example, you know, the color green, of course, is a part of that equation, and also something like the glossiness parameter. The reflectivity we see down here, if you try it yourself, you'll probably notice that the reflectivity doesn't change too much on first glance. What this is being used for is actually the angle in which the reflections are visible or are especially strong. So by changing the reflectivity, reflections will be even stronger when viewed from a sharp angle. By the way, if I happen to speak too fast at some point, or if anything is difficult to understand, or if you want me to go into further detail on anything, feel free to share your opinion in the questions field, and I'll be happy to respond to that. Below the reflectivity value we have here, we also have the transparency, TR, value, and you won't be too surprised if we dial up the slider, our surface becomes slightly transparent. We don't have much room below that. We have a surface right below our the surface that we're currently working on, but that doesn't matter. Enscape works in a physically or a physics-based way whenever it comes to materials. So whatever you set up in the width, so to say, that Enscape can show it, will behave correctly and physically correct. Exactly. So we can control the transparency to a degree we want. And maybe this is a good point to discuss glass, because we often hear people that ask us how to create the perfect glass. And really every glass requirement is a little bit different. So I heavily recommend to play around with the transparency, obviously, to have the glossiness set all the way up, ideally, in my opinion, at least. To have really nice and tasty reflections there, and also play around with the color. The brightness of the color that you select controls a lot about your glass, because with a darker color on your glass, you can dial down the transparency more and more, and you will get stronger or more visible reflections. We will cover this in more detail later on when having a look at the Enscape Material Editor. But pretty much this. Of course, you can also color your glass in a slightly bluish way if that's what you want, or reduce the transparency even further. If you're, for example, building a high-rise building and don't want to show too much of the insides, this is a good way to go. If you want to go for something like milk glass, by the way, we're going to have a look at that as well. That is what bump maps are the best use case, in my opinion. And in general, that is the main takeaway of this lesson today. Bump maps, height maps are the most important part, at least in my opinion. You can take my word for it, for a convincing and high quality material. So maps or textures. We also have a portion of that down here in the Rhino Material Editor. We can, by the way, combine a texture that we're using here. Let me reduce the transparency again. We can combine a texture that we're using here with the color that we select. For example, if we want to tint this color in a bluish way, by simply dialing down the strength of our texture input to maybe 50%, for example, and you'll see we will see a combination of the two of them. So that's a quick and really useful way, maybe, for example, during a client presentation, to switch the mood of a surface or an entire room really, really quickly, or simply, for example, darken a texture down if that's what your customer, your client wants to see. Below that, we have the transparency texture input. Let's see, maybe we can go with something like this here, for example. The transparency input takes the brightness value of a texture, dark or bright, and applies it as transparency to a surface. So you see right now, we have a now transparent surface with this pattern on it. And that's really great if you want to create something like a wire fence or something like these chairs as well. In this case, they're modeled, but that's actually not a very smart way to go about it. You can also just use a material and apply a transparency map to it. So you can really play around with it. And yes, that's also, of course, one of the great things about Enscape. You'll see results really, really quick. By the way, if you want to scale or position a texture in a different way, you can simply click on the texture's name here, and this will open the Rhino texture editor. This one is a little slow to load, so that's why I mainly prefer the Enscape Material Editor, but we're going to have a look at that in a couple seconds. If we wanted to make this texture smaller, for example, or actually, let's make it larger. That's the repeat value we have here as often, or the number that you put into this field is how often the texture will repeat on a given material. You see a representation of that up here. So if I put in a 2, for example, a lower value, the texture will actually appear larger and be repeated fewer times. Once again, the Rhino texture editor is a little slower, a little sturdy in its use, so that's a better, or you'll have a better experience with the Enscape Material Editor. We'll have a look at that in a second. Lastly, however, I want to enable this bump map just to show you what amount of detail you can create with that. Once again, we'll have a closer look at that later on when looking at it in the Enscape Material Editor. And here you see I didn't change the normal map we have here, so the bump input, and because of that, it's half the scale of my color map now. Still a nice way to show what amount of detail, once again, the bump map can add. Some more functions or some more features of a material, or of a material that you can use is the self-illumination. Self-illumination, as it already says, allows objects to emit light. So actually I will switch to these columns here, or pillars, and just change their material to glow in the dark. And I think I don't even have to enable self-illumination. Everything I have to do is change the emission color from black to a different value. And this is the result we're getting. Doesn't look like much at this point, but if we switch to night, I do that, by the way, by holding Shift and the right mouse button, we will see that now these actually emit light, and this is a possible way to illuminate your scene. This is especially great if you have something like neon lights, like maybe monitors, a lampshade, anything that seems to actually emit light in nature, and that's what you can use it for. Of course, you can also change the color, and this is a great way to actually visualize an object that is supposed to emit light, so a light bulb, something like that. You can also use the Rhino onboard lighting system, which we find in the render tools toolbar up here, to illuminate your scene. Let's have a look. Did I place it already? It looks like it. So those lights will work perfectly fine, and actually I recommend to light your scene with these lights that you can find in Rhino, because in Enscape they will give you a smoother and more high quality light experience. So even if we are further away from that, from this light source, they will give you smooth shadows and a high quality lighting experience. But as you see, we don't see the actual light source. We don't see a glowing orb here floating above the surface. So ideally you use them in combination, both the artificial light source that you can place in Rhino as well as the emissive light for the light source effect. These lights, however, I've hinted at that before, can create noisy light. That is simply the case because of some optimizations we have to enable for real-time display. So if you ever experience, or if you see this light noise somewhere in your project, you probably have an object with a self-illuminated or with an emissive material on somewhere in the scene, and the brighter and the smaller that object is, the more likely is you will get this noise or firefly effect, as we also call it. And a good way to get rid of that is just add a light source from Rhino, maybe color it in the desired color, and it will look much more smoothly, or much smoother. Nice. Okay, so this is pretty much an overview over the Rhino Material Editor. Let's not get tangled up in that for too long and rather switch to, let's see, to the Enscape Material Editor. So let's switch back. There we go. To see a material appear in the, or first of all, to open the Enscape Material Editor, you click this little button up here. Let me actually highlight it for you. This one. And this will open the Material Editor interface, obviously. And if you haven't switched a material type in your project to type Enscape yet, it will appear empty. So that's the case right now. We don't have any materials in here and can't change anything about it. To access a material in the Enscape Material Editor, we first need to switch it to type Enscape. If you try to do this with the Material Editor open, you will notice that you'll have to first close it to be able to access Rhino again. And yeah, let's go to the material and change its type from custom to type Enscape down here. Awesome. Now we see the controls of our Rhino material here have vanished, and we can now access the material right here in our Enscape Material Editor. There we are. So the first thing, or one of the first things we notice in the Enscape Material Editor is this type selection. We're going to have a look at that later on. Let's skip it for now and go with the default material type, because that is the most useful and the most used and the most the most useful. Let's stay with that. I'm sorry, I'm no native speaker. And let's get actually rid of the textures we have here so far by clicking on this little trash bin next to each texture and go with the very basic material we have at its core. Now the controls here in the Enscape Material Editor are fairly similar to what we have accessed before in the Rhino Material Editor. We have an albedo portion. The albedo portion is what is being called color in Rhino. So yeah, just remember that albedo stands for color. And once again, we can switch to any color we'd like really quick and continue with that. We can also load in a texture. Again, we will have a look at what exactly textures are about later on. Let me just pick a Enscape rendering here real quick and use it as my color texture. Now, first thing we see is it is quite large. Once again, we could use the Rhino Material Editor to change the repetition, the scale there, or I can click on this little icon, this little representation of my color texture that I've loaded in to continue editing it. We could replace the image file down here. We can control the brightness really quick. We can dial down the brightness if we want to. We can invert the entire color really quick here, and we can enable explicit texture transformation. This stands for texture scale. So here we will control the width and the height of the texture. I would like to say that this is set in meters, so width 1 means 1 meter. This is not really the case, because it responds to the scale of an object in Rhino. So if we have rescaled the object in Rhino, the width and height of the texture here will also be rescaled by that factor. So in this case, to make it smaller, I'll just enter 0. Let's go maybe with 0.2 and 0.2 here as well. And you see our texture has gone smaller. In this case, it is actually pushed to a square now because we have equal values here. But that's fine for me now. And we can also rotate the texture if we want to do that down here. And you might notice that everything reacts quite a bit faster than the Rhino Material Editor. So that is why I really prefer this Enscape Material Editor over the Rhino one. Once again, you can work with both. That's totally fine. The main difference the Enscape Material Editor provides is that we can not just add a color texture and a transparency texture and a height texture or map, but also a roughness texture. That is not included in Rhino. So to control the roughness of a surface, and once again, we'll have a look at that later on. So if you don't know what I'm referring to with all this texture talk, don't worry, we'll have a look at that. But yeah, that is an additional ability that the Enscape Material Editor provides that is not just available in the Rhino Material Editor. Okay, by dialing or by loading in my texture that I've loaded here, this image fade slider appeared and an additional color or an additional tint color value down here. What are these for? Well, with the image fade slider here, I can control the effect and the strength of the color texture in my on my surface. So if I set image fade to 100%, all the color is taken from my texture input. If I set it to 0%, all of the color is taken from my color input here. If I set it somewhere in the middle, it will be half-half. Let's go with something less strong, maybe a slight bluish tint, so to say. However, tint was the wrong word because with this image fade slider, we're using the input of either the one or the other. The tint color I have up here can add an additional color input to, or can add the color you select here to everything you have on this material in terms of color already. So this will actually morph the color we have on the surface additionally, or yeah, add like a layer on top of it. Once again, great thing about Enscape is it reacts really quick and you can play around with it and test yourself. All right, let's dial up the image fade here and let's get rid of the tint color. Let's set it to white to have our full color input here. Next below that is the self-illumination factor. This is really equal to what we have in Rhino. However, or with the one difference, you have a distinctive luminance or brightness input that you can control using the slider, and an additional color input. Once again, like the tint color, it adds like a layer on top of a light surface to change its color, and the color it illuminates your scene by or with. Let's disable it and enable transparency. This too is really similar to what we have in Rhino. We can just enable transparency globally for our material. We can use a texture. Let's go with this. There you go. And we can control the opacity here. We can also tint our glass or transparent surface, whatever this is. You can also use this, by the way, for eyes, for example. So any transparent surface. And we can change the refractive index. Refractive index, it's hard for me to show that right here and right now. It's better to see on curved surfaces like a vase or a glass of water or something like that. This will change the angle by which the light is being broken when moving through the surface, through the material. And this can be used to simulate thick glass. You can also enable frosted glass here, but once again, there's a better way to do that, to enable a frosted glass. So we're going to have a look at that in a second. Let me disable transparency here By the way, as you see, you can also use a texture without having transparency enabled. This will create a cutout texture. So a cutout texture has binary values. So it looks like your material is either solid or not there at all. Once again, this is a great way to create something like chainmail, wire fences, etc. Or you can get rid of it again. The height texture. Once again, I'm going to use this pattern we had before, but we'll have a look at how to get great looking textures for materials yourself soon in a minute. But to simulate what this can do is I'm going to use this pattern here again. And this is what that looks like. So it adds the illusion of depth to your surface, which is great if you're creating something like stone, cobblestone, wood. Pretty much every material has some differences in its height. So that's a great way to add an enormous amount of detail to your scene, to your visualization, without having to model all of it. So that's really useful. There's an additional function here. We can also switch to a normal map. We'll see in a second what a normal map is, or to a displacement map. And a displacement map will actually deform the surface very, very strongly, as you see here. So it pays off to dial down the amount of that quite a bit. But this is awesome if you want to create something like that looks like the surface actually changed in a large, or in a really distinctive manner. Something like, again, cobblestone, some rocky surfaces, whatever you want to add really strong surface deformation to. Hope it's visible. And as you see, it will, of course, interact with your lighting settings and all in all behave correctly and work as you expected. Nice. Okay, let's get rid of that. We'll have a look at that later on when we set up some proper materials. Actually, let me disable my color texture again so it looks a little bit nicer. And we can have a look at it one more time to make it, to really drive it home how strong or how powerful this feature is. If we switch to displacement map, how much of an effect you can create with that. Once again, play around with it and you'll get beautiful results in no time. All right, below that we have the roughness. The roughness is very much the opposite of the glossiness we've had a look at earlier on in the Rhino Material Editor. So if I dial it down, we will have a really reflective surface, a microscopically smooth surface. If we dial it up, the reflections, and every material is reflecting light, but the reflections will get more and more diffuse, spread out in random directions, and therefore look like a microscopically rough surface, like concrete, wood, sometimes plaster, and so on. Here too, as mentioned, we can use a texture. Enscape will take the black and white or dark and bright input and change the reflectivity accordingly. So that way, once again, you can create really intricate and beautiful patterns really, really quick and add detail to your scene, which is overall what we're striving for as visualizers. Because detail is what is really hard to achieve manually in a project, and that is eventually what really convinces the viewer that something is an image, is a real scene, rather than an artificially created image. Below that, we have the metallic slider. If you want your material to behave like a metal, and that means in essence that the reflections are much more true to, well, their origin, which means a non-metallic surface will add color to it, the color we selected to any reflection. A metallic surface, if it is smooth, will not add any color to it, which means if you want to create a mirror, for example, you have to go for a metallic surface because it will create perfect reflections, just like that. And yeah, we can also control the specular here, like mentioned, or that is what the reflective value is for in the Rhino material. So if we have a low specular value with a low roughness, we will have reflections that disappear when viewed from the top from a sharp angle. If we increase the specular value, reflections will be visible even from a steep angle like that. All right, that would be the top level overview over the Enscape Material Editor. Let's head over and have a look at the various material types that are available in the Enscape Material Editor and explain a couple of those in more detail. So first of all, we have the default material as just covered. Next, we have the grass material. This will display your material as grass blades, and they'll even sway in the wind by default. So this is also a great way to add a lot of detail and a lot of motion to your visualization, and by that a lot of believability. Obviously, this is no real grass color we are seeing here, but that is great because you can decide for yourself what color your grass should have. And if you add a texture to it, a color texture with some slight differences, some more brownish parts, some more green parts, that will really make the grass look real and convincing. And actually, if you want to try out a trick, I'm afraid we don't have the time to do that today, but I have found to make a believable grass material, you can pretty much take any grass photo or any pretty much any grass photo, for example, and make it really, really large. It doesn't have to be realistic. It's just to get those slight color differences onto the surface. So yeah, play around with it, and you can get beautiful results in no time. You see that we have some more controls down here, like the height input and reflectivity, roughness, which won't make an effect for your grass material. But below that, the grass settings, you can also change the height and the height variation to make it look a little more natural, a little more unkempt, or by dialing the height variation down all the way, you can make it look like it's just freshly mown. Below that, we have the water material type. This is quite simple. It will turn your surface into water. Once again, we won't see too much of that right now because we have a surface right below that, but we have another water material right over here, and this shows it quite nicely. You should really have a nice or a surface some realistic distance below the surface, because this will create these beautiful caustics that you see down there. And as you see, everything is animated by default. If we stand still in Enscape, it will stop moving, but whenever we move, the water moves and the caustics, those light reflections down there, move. And also if you create something like a video or a VR experience, all of this will move naturally. And taking into account, by the way, the wind settings, which you can access. Let me see. Oh, I need to close the material editor, obviously. We go. And if you go to the general settings, no, sorry, I think I'm wrong. Yeah, exactly. Sorry. We have to open the visual settings up here. And in the atmosphere tab, you have global wind settings where you can change the intensity and the direction. You can override it in the material editor as mentioned, but if you don't do that, and I recommend not to do that, because that will give you a consistent result between grass and the trees as well that move in the wind, the Enscape asset trees and the water, everything will behave consistently. All right. Here you can also change the wave height and wave scale, and once again, change the wind settings if you want to. By the way, watercolor, you can change it if you want to. You will get a different result if you want to go for a more reddish water or something like that. Of course, if it has a certain depth, if it's shallow, like in nature, you won't see any color input. But if you want to have realistic water, we recommend to go with just the white color, because that is what default water behaves like. Oh, and by the way, here you can also control the caustics intensity, so those light reflections at the floor. And I really like to dial these up to 100% to have the extra kick and the extra visual beauty on it. Next is the foliage material type. This one is used quite rarely. It has a nice effect if you know how to use it. Essentially, this will make a surface translucent. So let me actually go with a different surface here. Just closing down the Enscape Material Editor, waiting for Rhino to respond. Oh, I didn't close it down, so my bad. There we go. So, and I'm just going to select this surface here and change the material type to Enscape. And already we can access it in the Enscape Material Editor as well, and change it from type water to type foliage to show you what this is about. Because foliage will make a surface translucent. So if I change the sun angle now, you will see, of course, you will see shadows on there, and you will see the sun shining through the surface. However, this material type only works with single phase materials. So as soon as a object has depth to it, you won't see any of this effect anymore. And it also only works with natural sun, so not with artificial light sources. So this material is usually used for, well, you might have guessed it, foliage, for leaves, to make this beautiful self-shadowing and translucency effect on those. And once again, add beautiful detail to our scene. Should we continue with this surface? Why not? I think I like that. So yeah, the next material type is clear coat. This is a special type of material that is mainly used for car paint. Once again, we can change the roughness to make it more or less reflective. We can change the metallic value, but I would recommend to keep it at 100% because that's what that material is supposed to look like. And as you see, this will skew the color sort of at a certain angle looking at it. So you can create really beautiful, really interesting looking color or paint materials, painted metal materials this way. Next, we have the carpet material, and this one is fairly similar to our grass material. The main difference is it is using a different texture, so the carpet material actually looks different, and it is not moving in the wind because we know that a lot of users have been using our grass material to simulate something like carpet, and so it is not swaying in the wind on the inside somewhere. We have added the carpet material to yeah, make that easier for you. Of course, once again, if you want to use something like a texture for it, let's see if I have something interesting. Let's go with this logo again. Your carpet will show that correctly, of course. In this case, the surface has been morphed to the side quite strongly. So we could go in and, for example, add some explicit texture transformation and make it, let's see if I'm on the right track here. Okay, I am, but I'll probably need to change it down entirely. So let's go with 0.1 and 1. And that way we have this material appear a lot more often. And yeah, as you see, this will show up as or look like a real carpet much more than moving grass. All right, that is an overview over the different material types you can access with Enscape. Let me switch back to water, and our scene has been saved again. Okay, let's see. Next in line is where to find textures. So textures, you probably have noticed that already, are really powerful, really useful to enhance your scene and especially add detail, which is all that visualization is about when you want to make it look realistic. Now, as you've seen in my case, you can use any image type to add detail, to use as a texture for any of the inputs that are available in the Enscape or Rhino Material Editor. But you have also seen that these textures tend to be repetitive. Any surface you place a texture on, if that surface is not really made for that texture or the texture for that surface, will show repetition, a tiling effect, and this can disrupt the natural look of something. So there are ways to create your own repetitive tileable textures. We won't go into that today, but there are also really great sources where you can get textures either paid for example, Polygon.com is one of those sources where you can get thousands and thousands of textures in high quality, some of them free, some of them paid for, but really affordable. So that can be one way. If you want to get started playing around with textures, I recommend something that used to be cc0textures.com. It got recently renamed to Ambient CG. The thing is the same. You have public domain materials, so you can use all of these. I think it's over 1,500 by now. Textures, materials in your daily work if you want to, and you, oh sorry, 1336. You can use these in your daily work, and you can play around with it and use them for commercial purposes. Any of the materials you see here, you can download a texture pack, so it will always be multiple textures, and you can use these with Enscape right away, and they'll just look astonishing. So maybe let's be a little playful, and let's go with this rocky surface here, so we can see multiple ways or multiple kinds of texture use. And now this website will ask you in what resolution to download these. I recommend to go with 2K JPEG textures, because all of these textures that you're using in your project have to fit on your graphics card when using Enscape. And the smaller they are, the better, as long as they are not as small. And by small, I mean lightweight in resolution. The smaller they are, the more you can use in your project and not lower your performance. So that is also really, really useful. Now you see with this material, for example, we have gotten there we go. We have gotten 5 image files. Wait a second. There we are. Oh, let me just minimize this window. Or not. Let's just go with Scape. And you see we have 5 image files. Let me just throw them on my desktop so we can have a look at those together. This is a common set of textures. This is a common format that you can use with many 3D packages and solutions. Wait a second, I'm moving them over here. There we are. So we have some textures that are useful for Enscape and some textures that are less useful for Enscape. However, you can still use them and play around with them. The one that is not really used by Enscape is ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is a technique that is mainly used by offline renderers. Enscape works in a physics-based environment, so we don't use it. We generate those ourselves, sort of. However, it is a black and white map, and you can control almost any attribute that we've had a look at earlier. The bump attribute, the roughness attribute. You can control all of this with black and white textures. So you can have a look at those and try them, and they'll probably look just as fine. But we have better textures for that. First of all, we have the color texture. Let me just go with that briefly and have a look at it. And yeah, let's actually go ahead and connect them to our Enscape material right away. So I'm going to open my Enscape Material Editor and click on texture next to albedo to put in the color input here. And let's see. I have a couple of those on my desktop already. Let's go with this one, and you'll see this has added a color input. It's even better visible if we dial up the roughness so we don't see that much of the reflections. And this is a good first step to add. Oh, it's still metallic. That's why. Yeah, that's why it's so dark. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, it will not add the color to the reflections. So so if we go with that, actually that's, oh yeah, specular is still enabled. Oh, sorry, and we're still in clear code mode. So yeah, this is what a really rough surface will look like with some color enabled. And as you see, this is a good first start to add detail to our scene, but it doesn't really look convincing. It looks very flat. It looks like a pattern that has been printed onto the surface. But there is one more thing. You don't see the repetition as clearly. Of course, it is repeating. We can, where's my controls there? We can make it more visible, or I can highlight it for you. We have this dark patch, for example, here and here again. So it is repeating, but the borders of the textures are edited so it's not as clearly visible, and that is the most important part about it. That's why I recommend these websites. However, even though you don't see the repetition, it doesn't look realistic. Once again, let me actually dial down the roughness a little bit so we'll see it even stronger. Once again, by adding a height texture, that is where the real detail will come into play. And we have 2 height textures we can choose from here. We have the normal texture and the displacement texture. Both can be used with Enscape. Let's start with the normal one. You might wonder, wait a second, the other textures, they were black and white. Why is this one purple-ish? Well, the background is the other textures give you a binary or a single value per pixel, a color, a brightness, which Enscape then takes to calculate the distance that something has to be pushed in or extruded from a surface. A normal map can actually give you 3 values per pixel, that is red, green, and blue. But with that, we can derive a vector. So in theory, a normal texture, let's go with the one I've just had a look at. A normal texture can give you higher quality results. Let's dial up the intensity a bit so we see it more clearly. Because it will not just give you, well, a height, it will actually give you a direction of the surface. So you see the shadows really work with that really nicely, the daytime changes, etc. But you see we still have a quite flat surface. That is the same if we go with the displacement map we've had a look at earlier. By the way, you can also just click use albedo, and Enscape will just take the color texture and see what it can do, what's the best it can do with it. But if we have these beautiful textures available that we've just downloaded, why not go with those? So yeah, I'll take the displacement texture here as a bump map, and we will have a similar result. I usually prefer the displacement textures because they, I prefer the displacement textures to normal maps because they, I feel like they give me a cleaner result. So I really like to go with those. But it's up to you. I would recommend to try it once in a while, whether the normal map or the bump map works better, or the displacement map works better for you. I usually prefer the displacement map. So yeah, you see we've added a great deal of detail. We can make it even more reflective by dialing down the roughness here to make this effect even stronger. But once again, we have a quite flat surface, and the shape did not really change. This can work really great for some materials like wood, for example. For a rocky surface like this, where we have some really serious surface deformation, we might want to switch to a displacement map. So I'm going to dial down the bump, the amount down here, and change the mode to displacement. And here you see we have a very, very different effect result right away. So we really have some deformation here, and we have a perception of a uneven surface. And yeah, that's all the magic to really create a convincing and beautiful material. I'm going to dial down the depth effect here and also the color effect by dialing down the image fade real quick, so we can see the effect of the roughness map that I'm going to add. So once again, we can of course control the roughness with the slider, or we can load in the roughness texture, and we will see, especially if we have some light shining from the other side. So let's go change the daytime, and this is where you see the subtle variations in the reflectivity of the surface. And this can be really enough for a nice looking material. When setting up materials, one really important rule is it's not about making obvious changes. It's oftentimes just about adding some subtle highlights, some subtle irregularities, just like this one that might not show up all the time, but if the sun is set correctly or the lights look the right way, it will be visible. And it's something that people perceive very strongly, and even, you know, that can evoke some emotions there, especially of course if we add some displacement, that, you know, can make people think about what it feels like to walk barefoot on a surface, for example. And that's really when people imagine the building they're going to live in, and they can give you a much better and more detailed feedback right away what they actually are looking for. And yeah, that's what Enscape is for, to create emotions really quick from your bare project input. Let's see. I think, yeah, I mean, we've covered pretty much the last portion as well. What kind of textures are there and how to use them? So we're a little bit later than I anticipated. I don't see any questions in the questions field yet. This would be my introduction to materials, the Enscape Material Editor, and what textures are. Are there any questions? If so, feel free to type them in the questions field right now, and I'll be happy to answer them, or play around with it. Have a look at the recording of this webinar if you want to. If you have Enscape installed already, open it up and yeah, have a look at those websites. By the way, you'll get a link to those websites that I've mentioned in the follow-up email as well. And if you stumble upon some questions later on, for example, you can always reach out to us by, for example, hitting the feedback button right here in the Enscape interface. Let me highlight that for you as well. Or write us an email to support@enscape3.com. Or once again, have a look at our forums. And feel free to get in touch with the community right there. Or have a look at what others do with these beautiful abilities. Let's not watch a video right now because I know you see a low frame rate, unfortunately. There we go. There is a question. Lorenzo, hi, can you change the texture of the house to bricks? I have problems with the corners. This sounds very much like you just have to go for the website that, oh no, I know what you mean, I suppose. Let's go for some brick texture. Maybe this one, for example. Download that. Throw it on my desktop. I'm sorry, you have to watch the amount of detail on my desktop. Not here, but once I load the texture. Let me actually, oh yeah, we want me to change the texture on the house, right? That's a little bit of a problem with this project here. Well, actually, it seems like, yeah, let's just change all of them. And I think I now have a multitude of materials. Yeah, right here. There is one neat trick I like to do to figure out what material we're looking at. Just change the color. And once you see the color change in Enscape, you can be pretty sure that you have gotten the right material. But it looks like it won't be any of these Archicad materials. It's going to be one of the unnamed ones. So let's see. This one, no, but the other. Yes, so that's the right one. So let's add, first of all, the color texture that we've downloaded. There is the paving stone texture, and it's really large. So let's go in and go to, which looks like maybe 0.01. Let's see. And there we go. No, that's too small. So let's go with 0.1. Way better. Okay, and let's add a height texture to that. Ideally a fitting one. So we have this one, and it's the displacement one. Let's actually go with the same values, 0.1 and 0.1. I'm not sure why it's not fitting exactly, but let's not go into that. Oh yeah, of course, because I got the wrong one. So my bad. Here is the one we downloaded. So that one, displacement. That's looking a lot better. So let's switch to displacement map. And I suppose you don't have these issues, Lorenzo, with bump maps. And that's also my solution that I would recommend to go for with bump maps, if possible. If you enable displacement map and if it's too strong, well, Enscape is not using actual displacement, so we're not actually changing the surface. We're also creating the illusion of that here. So it's using a parallax system. So it creates artificial depth in the surface. And yeah, if you have some borders, and it looks good in this case. However, if we have a close look at this corner here, you see that something looks off, and that's simply because we cannot change the real shape of our surface. We are adding some artificial depth. So yeah, this you have to look on a material basis. In this case, it's actually not that bad because our cobblestones are kind of fitting here. If you experience issues there, feel free to reach out to us and send us an example, and maybe we can find a solution for you. Maybe we can also hold a web session with you to identify the issue with your particular project. Let's see, Nicola, I have a question too. How can I use Enscape to create 2D images? I can find an export button. To create 2D images, you just click this render image button or screenshot button, and this will render a image in the resolution that you have set up in the visual settings capture tab. That's how you create a simple image, just this button here. Hope that helps. Can you move the texture to make the bricks match the one on the other side? I'm afraid we don't have the time today anymore because the webinar essentially already ended. You can of course use the Rhino Material Editor to align those textures and then return the type back to type Enscape, and it should take over those the changes you've performed to the texture placement in your project. All right, looks like that's all the questions for now. Once again, if something hasn't been covered, feel free to reach out to us. Other than that, have lots of success with Enscape. Thank you very much for attending. It's been a pleasure to hold the presentation for you. And if you create some stunning imagery, be it a video or panorama or standalone or an image, feel free to share it in the forums. We're always looking forward to that, or that's always the best reward for the work we're doing. Other than that, stay safe and have a good time. See you next time. Goodbye.